Today we're going to be going over some advanced tabular development concepts. So a big misconception with tabular databases is that they can't do everything that multidimensional could do, and it's much more difficult to get it done and it's actually quite the opposite. It's much more easy to do tabular development than it was to do multidimensional, where multidimensional you had to build up the entire house of cards and then hope everything worked just perfectly. You got to the very last card, you put it on top, and the whole thing collapsed. With tabular, it's a WYSIWYG interface, so as you're building it, it's making those changes live right there with you, and you can see, okay, if I'm going to break this, it's going to show me everything I'm going to break right during my development cycle. My name's Chris Schmidt. I work for Pragmatic Works. I'm a senior consultant. You can find me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @SQLBISchmidt, and I blog at a site called intelligentsql.wordpress.com. And, wow, I've never seen it take so long to go between slides before. Come on. There we go. So that's a little bit about me. I always try to keep the About Me slides pretty brief. Nobody really wants to know. You just want the material, right? So today, the first topic we're going to talk about is perspectives. And perspectives are the same way they worked in multidimensional, but we can filter down large cubes into more manageable pieces. So it's almost like a view in flat table land, you could think of it as, where we're taking this huge set of all this data and we're narrowing it down to maybe 3 or 4 tables that you can use to browse on instead of having the whole monster of a cube. So if you have a user that only uses 1 or 2 things, just build them a perspective and make it much easier for them to filter through that big, long, hairy pivot table list in Excel. It's helpful to users who are only interested in a very small subset of the cube. However, you can't use them for security. It's only a better browsing experience tool. So there's no security implementation you can do around a perspective. You can't say only show these people this. You can do it through a different way, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but perspectives are only used to filter down one large cube into smaller pieces that you can browse easier. And then let's switch over. I'm going to switch back and forth between our PowerPoint presentation here and our actual environment. So in this environment, I have internet sales, so AdventureWorks. We all love it, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, and I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to my Zoom It on this machine, so I apologize in advance. It disappeared somehow. But I'm going to try to kind of keep it as easy as possible to follow. But in my internet sales table here, up in the top, in the middle part, I have a couple of sections. I have a roles. We're going to go over that a little bit later. And then to the right of that, I have a little tile called partitions. And it's right in the middle of my page. And if I click on it, it's going to give me all the different partitions that I have. And what I can do is I can partition this analysis services table up, so that way, instead of having to process everything every day when I do my nightly processing, I can only process what's new. So you could almost use it. It's very useful for processing only new data. If I have data from 2005, for example, chances are my table is probably not modifying very much every day, right? Like my data from 2005 is pretty static. It's not really moving very much, and I'm pretty confident that that's where it's going to stay. So maybe I don't process that partition every day. I only want to process that like once a month or once a quarter. And what I can do is I can break that up so that when I'm doing my nightly processing, I'm only processing the current data that's more volatile in nature. And to create my partition, to start, one second. Let's see what's going on here. All right. No services either. This machine is just all over the place today. All right, so we're going to scroll down here, and we're just going to turn on our SQL Server service. Sorry about that, guys. Not sure why it's deciding to be difficult. There we go. All right. I should fix that issue. So as I open up my partitions here again, over on the right, I have a table. Zoom, it's killing me. I have two options. I can either table bind my partition, or I can SQL bind my partition. And to SQL bind my partition, all I need to do is I just need to click on the little icon called SQL, and I can modify my query to only pull in what I specify. So I can put a where clause. In this case, we're ordering by the order date, or we're partitioning by the order date. So I can say I only want to see orders in this partition where it's between 2005 January 1st and 2005 December 31st. Now I need to be really careful if I'm going to implement this, because I don't want to kind of double hit myself. So if I'm going to say where order date is less than or equal to 2005 12/31, I need to make sure that the next one, I either say it's greater than 2005 12/31, or it's, use the next day, 2006 01/01. If you include the same date in there, it's going to put that same data point in both partitions, and instead of counting it as 1, it's going to count it as 2. So you want to be careful in regards to that when you're creating it. But overall, it's a really great way to narrow down your result sets when you're processing. So you can see in this table we have a 2005 partition, a 2006, and 2007, so on. We're pretty much partitioning this one by year. But now when we're doing our nightly processing, the only thing we're going to update every night is our current data. So we're just going to do, in this case, 2010. So our 2010 data is what we're going to process every night, because that's what's highly volatile. But let's say we have a billion rows in a cube, and we're only getting maybe 100 million a night. We don't have to process all billion rows a day. We can only process the million or so that we have. So partitions are a very nice way to speed up performance very quickly. If you're having problems with an analysis services cube just processing overnight, check into the partitions. Regardless of whether it's multidimensional or tabular, a lot of times you can get some significant performance improvements just by creating partitions out. And, whoa, I'm so sorry, guys. So now that I just went through the demo for partitions, we'll go through perspectives next. But I'm going to cover the partitions slide real quick here. Partitions allow large tables to be split into smaller pieces, so we don't have to reprocess the entire table like we're just saying. It improves performance, and one big rule with Tabular is that you can only process partitions for multiple tables in parallel, but you can't process tables for the same table in parallel. So what that means is if I have multiple partitions across, say, 3 different tables, I could process one partition from each of those 3 tables together, but I could never process all 3 partitions in the same table at the same time. A big rule of partitioning as well is that if you're using DirectQuery mode, which we'll go over a little bit later, you can only have 1 partition per table. So since you're removing analysis services kind of completely from the equation, you're actually doing all that partitioning at the relational level, and we'll go over that a little bit later as well. But I am going to go back and go over perspectives, because apparently I am just all over the place this morning. But if I come into my tabular database again, and over towards the left, right next to where I'm going to create my new connections and bring in my import from data source, I get this field up called perspectives. And in my perspectives, I've got a couple of different options here. I can see, here's a list of all my tables over here on the left-hand side. And as I expand it, I can see here's each of my columns that I have. So I can actually take this down to the attribute level. I could say in the employee perspective, I want to make maybe name style available to this perspective, but I don't want middle name to be available in that perspective. And I can do that all the way down with everything that I've got, with every table, every attribute that I have. To create a new perspective, I'm just going to create the new perspective button up here. It's going to ask me to give it a name, and we'll call it my perspective. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to check everything that I want to see. You'll notice too, as I'm hovering over top of this, I have 3 buttons up at the top. I can either delete my perspective, I can rename it, or I can copy it. So if I'm creating a whole bunch of perspectives all at once, all I need to do is just copy one, uncheck some things, and check the other. So maybe a lot of them are very, very similar. And the nice thing about a perspective is once I connect to it in Excel, so I'm going to come into Excel here, and I'm going to create a connection to my tabular instance here. And then we can see I've got all my different perspectives that I have, and then I have my main cube. So I could connect to my main cube if I'm looking for maybe everything about a whole bunch of different stuff. Maybe in this case I want to know about internet sales and reseller sales all at the same time, and I want it all in the same workbook. If I want to create different views, then maybe I want to create a worksheet that's all about internet sales, and then I want to create a worksheet that's all about reseller sales, and then I want to create another worksheet down at the end that's all about internet products. I can just connect to those perspectives, and as I connect to those perspectives, I have a much smaller list of data to browse on the right-hand side in my pivot table list than I would if I was connecting to the whole cube. So in this case, it's 4 tables, but you can see that if I connected to just say the overall cube, if I connect to the overall cube, as soon as we get through those last couple of pop-ups, I have much more in terms of availability, but it's also a lot more difficult for me to browse this data and get through what I want to see. Okay? All right. So the next slide I've got here is all about dynamic security. And when you're building a tabular database, it's very easy to go through and do all the creating, and you've got this really cool tabular database, you're showing it to everybody in the company, and then your management says, well, what about security? I want to make sure that the right people connect to this at the right time. So if customer A connects, I only want them to see customer A's data, and if customer B connects, I only want them to see customer B data. But then let's say, our CEO, we want him to be able to see everybody, regardless of who the customer is, regardless of where they're at, regardless of what sales territory they're in. So essentially, we want to show A if user A logs in, and we want to show this if user B logs in. But if user C logs in, then we want to show both of these things. And we can actually tune this to be user-based. So from a user level perspective, or from a user level, we can say who's connecting to this cube. And as they're connecting to this cube, I want to change what they can see. So I don't know up front. My alternative is I could create 1,000 different roles, one for every customer, and just assign it to it. But that's a lot of development time, and I'd rather do it from a much more dynamic perspective than that. And so to do that, to start, I'm going to show a table that I created in our data warehouse here. Open up AdventureWorks here, and then down we have a table called User Security. And if I open that, I have a couple of different fields available here. I have an employee key, then I have a sales territory, and then I have what the employee's first name, last name, and their username is. Now, if in the real world I'm probably going to have a much cleaner, simpler table, I'm only going to have probably employee key and sales territory key, which is going to be a bridge between my employee table and my sales table. Just to keep it simple for this demo, I wanted to go ahead and just kind of break it down for the employee and have it be a little bit further out. But you could also do the same thing if you wanted to bridge on, say, maybe 5 or 6 different things. So I wanted to say, what sales territory can they see? What products can they see? What countries can they see? Or what regions and what customer base? I could do all that stuff just with a little bridge table like this. So you can see my bridge table here. It's nothing really fancy. All I've got is my employee key, my sales key, and in this case, the administrator has access to see both sales territory 1 and 2. Bob Williams only has access to see the 3rd sales territory, and Steve Smith can only see my sales territory 4. And if I come in here into my tabular model, that's really all I need to do from a database engine perspective. And the rest of it's all done in here in Tabular. So if I come in here in Tabular, we're going to click Existing Connection, and we're going to open it. And then we're going to import that user security table. And as we import it, I'm going to click Cancel here instead of Finish because I've already got it in my model here. But I wanted to walk through the steps there. And then I'm going to have it in my diagram view. And I want to create a relationship between my sales territories and my employees. So it's going to be almost like a factless fact bridge table. You could almost think of it. So here's my sales territory. And I'm tying my sales territory key to my user security sales territory key. So for every time I get a user that logs in, I want to find that user in the user security table, and I want to look it up against the sales territory key to see what they're allowed to see. And if I had an employee table, and I was using this as an actual bridge table, I would just have another employee table right here next to it, and this would just be a little bridge table that sits between the two of them. So once I've done that, I've imported my table and I've created my relationship. So it's taken me all of 2 minutes or 3 minutes, as long as it took me to create that table. It's very simple to set up from that perspective. And then click Role. And then in the Role tab, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to create a new role. And my new role, I'm going to call it Sales Territory Users in this case, because that's what I'm browsing off of. But as I scroll down, I'm going to create a DAX filter. And my DAX filter is going to be for my sales territory. And I want it to evaluate every time my user security equals false. So every time my user security table is getting something passed into it, I want to resolve it and say, okay, filter out anything where it doesn't match in that user security table. So if I'm logging in and I'm not allowed to see sales territory key 3, then I want it to filter out sales territory key 3 from my user security table. So it's false. I'm going to create some members, and we'll come back to that other one in just a second here. And I'm going to add my members of Steve, Bob, and my administrator. A handy feature with this is you could also use this for Active Directory groups. So rather than having to go down to the user granular level, I could only use, say, maybe I have a Northeast region employees, or maybe I have a just Southeast region, or just United States people. I can assign everybody into that AD group, maybe everybody in the finance department, for example. And everybody in that AD group can see X, and everybody not in the AD group can see Y. But I could also do the same thing at an AD level. And if I come back over here to my row filters tab, under my sales territory, this is where we're going to do all of our actual kind of analysis. And I'm going to try to make this pretty big. And I'm sorry, guys. I don't know why my Zoom it's acting up on me today. Apparently it just decided that it's going to enjoy this fine Colorado weather that we're having and go take a hike in some mountains. And in my sales territory, I'm going to say where my sales territory key, so here's my sales territory table, and sales territory key equals my lookup value. So I'm going to look up the value every time somebody logs in here. I'm going to look up the value against the user security table. I'm looking up the sales territory key again, which is just where my join is going to happen. And then I'm looking up to my user security username table. And in my user security username table, that's that username column of the person that's logging in. And this very next column here, this username function, in DAX, I can use this username function to return the name of the user that's currently logged in. So as someone's logging in, it's going to populate this username function, and I'm just going to map to it and pick it up as it's coming through. And then I'm going to do this user security table. I'm going to specify my sales territory key syntax again, and I'm mapping it to my sales territory key table. And when I do that, I get the ability, if I click on this Analyze in Excel up here, we'll select under a other Windows user. And we'll browse as Bob here. So we're going to see what Bob can see. So when Bob logs in, this is what Bob's going to be able to see. And we'll just connect to the default perspective. This is a really useful way to test your security as well. But what's really nice about it is it's a lot easier to do than it was in multidimensional. So in multidimensional, you had that role that you had to create the role, and then you had to add the members, and then you had some MDX that you had to write, and it was kind of ugly sometimes. But if I come in here and I select my sales territory, as I browse this over, I can see that let's create this. That in this case, Bob only has access to the central sales territory in the United States region. And I could go through and test this against everybody else as well. I think I kind of got the point, so I'm going to stop. But you can see how you can narrow that down so that only one person can see what you want them to specify them to see. And what's nice about this is I don't have to worry about coming in here and modifying the tabular database every time somebody makes a change. So every time employee A leaves the company or every time employee B gets hired into the company, I don't have to change my tabular model. It's, okay, add a row to that user security table. Maybe I have an SSIS package that populates that user security table from my HR system. It just removes and deletes people and adds people in as it's needed. I can completely automate this process, and I have to do very little maintenance over it in regards to everyday security of who can access it, when can they access it, why can they only see that, and why can they see this. It's much easier for me to do instead of having to deal with all that granularity and maintenance of it. All right. So the next thing I want to go over is tabular query types. So tabular databases are very, very different from multidimensional. In multidimensional, it processes, it does its thing behind the scenes, and it's going to create those indexes and create that stuff on disk, and that's it. You didn't really get a lot of choice. You could customize between MOLAP and ROLAP, but even that, you still weren't really changing the way that the engine worked. You were more just kind of changing how it was geared and what it was looking for. With tabular databases, you have a completely different option in the fact that you can create or you can select what kind of browsing experience you want your user to use. So I can say I want them to use in-memory, or I want them to use a different type. So I want to customize this based off what I want to see. My in-memory is my default. That's the X-velocity engine that we all hear so much about. So this is the huge compression, the keeping everything in memory. This is tabular database. It's default. It's what it does at its core. And what it's going to do there in my X-velocity is it's the default mode. It compresses my transactional data to about 1/10 of its original size. So getting about 90% compression, which is huge in regards to keeping all that stuff in memory. It's fast. It runs in memory, obviously. It's called in memory. We've talked about it a couple of times already. And it's running off from cache files. So everything that it's running as it's processing, it's caching it, and it can pull it back up really, really quickly. One important thing to note, though, is that queries are translated to MDX from Excel and SQL Server Management Studio. And if I come in here and I come into my tabular database, I'm going to open up SQL Server Profiler here too, so I can jump on. I haven't jumped on the extended events bandwagon yet, so my apologies. So I've got my trace here. Uh-oh, I hope I remember my trace against my analysis services instance. It doesn't look like I did it. Oh. No, I didn't. All right. So let's come back into Management Studio. And I'm just going to browse against my AdventureWorks tabular model. I'm just going to create some things and just drag over a couple of attributes. It doesn't really matter what. So let's take our internet sales. Let's take our total freight. And let's take over our customer. We'll take over gender. And as I do that and I come into Profiler, I can see that the data that it's actually passing into the engine is MDX, which is really, really interesting if you think about it, because we hear all about DAX and we hear what great things DAX can do, but at its core, Management Studio is still running and still pulling that as an MDX file. So it's still running it as MDX. It's translating what our query is into MDX against the server as it's running. It's very interesting when you start profiling the events and profiling the traces as they're coming through to see what they're looking like. And regardless of if I use Excel or Management Studio or whatever, I'm always going to get that MDX as it's being translated as it's coming across. The other option I have in tabular databases is, I've never had PowerPoint be so slow. There we go. So the other option I have is called DirectQuery. And DirectQuery is a different type of tabular modes, but it's handy in situations where the data is too large for memory. So that's kind of a hard number to narrow down on. Some bigger shops have production servers with terabytes of RAM on them. Other shops, small mom and pop shops only have 6 or 8 gigs on their production server. So it depends on what your configuration is and what your production environment can handle based on what's technically quote-unquote too large. So, I mean, it could be 100 gigs and up. It could be 50 gigs and up. It all depends. It all comes down to hardware sizing your server. There's some really handy material out there about hardware sizing a tabular services server or a tabular database server to make sure that it can handle what you expect it to handle. Another nice thing about DirectQuery is it runs directly on top of your transactional model. So there's not very much. So your queries are translated to SQL from SQL Server Management Studio. However, with that being said, there's no calculated columns. You can't do row-level security. And most importantly, is you can't use Excel to browse the model. And the reason why is because Excel's translating all that into MDX, and you cannot translate it from Excel into your SQL that it needs to pull from the table. So there's no calculated columns, there's no security. The security is handled at the database level. So if you wanted to do something like that dynamic security, you'd have to do it at the database engine level and create some roles to make sure that you can only see what you wanted to see. In my opinion, I think not having Excel is probably the biggest pain about DirectQuery. We've been preaching for years about getting people to use Excel to browse this analysis services database. And then we have DirectQuery, which is great because we can use it to query, straight on top. We can use it to query huge data sets, so terabytes and terabytes of social media data, of financial data, everything's coming through that we want to see, and we want to see it real time. So I want to see exactly when did this transaction happen for this card, but I can't use Excel to browse it. But I can see real-time data, so it's a trade-off. And if I come in here to switch something to DirectQuery mode, I'm going to open up a different solution so that we can take a look. And I want to make sure that I get it loaded. Here we go. All right, so if I come in here and I right-click on my project and I go to Properties, there's a property in here under Configuration and Deployment. Oh, sorry, debugging. No, where did it go? My property went running away from me. Whoop. I right-click on the BIM file. Sorry, that was my fault. So if I right-click on here, on the actual project level, on the BIM file, which is my solution, my project where I'm loading stuff, I right-click on it and I go to Properties, there's a setting. And the setting is called DirectQuery mode. And by default, it's set to off. And if I change this from off to on, it's going to run through and it's going to run a whole bunch of rules against it. And it's going to find if I've got any calculated columns anywhere, if I've got anything that's breaking the rules for what I can put in DirectQuery. And as I put that into DirectQuery, it's going to run all those rules, make sure that I'm not breaking anything. If I am breaking something, it's going to spit out an error, and it's going to say I can't convert this to DirectQuery because you have a you have a calculated column in this table, and this table is doing X, and you've got all these dependencies off of it. There we go. And so if I right-click on the project, under Query Mode up here at the top, I have a couple of different options. And by default, it's going to be set to in-memory. But I also have a direct query. And then I have two others as well. I have an in-memory with direct query, and I have a direct query with in-memory. So, well, what's the difference? Because they're really the same thing, right? They just have different words in different orders. But if I come in here, I'm going to fire up PowerPoint. I promise the last couple PowerPoint slides we're almost done. The brutality is over, the torture. So the first one is I've got DirectQuery. And DirectQuery means it's going to process and store my model in DirectQuery mode. So it's going to do the processing. It's going to look to the relational engine whenever possible. It's going to try to use DirectQuery as much as I can. However, I can select what option I want by setting the property in the connection string. And it's going to use DirectQuery if I don't specify it. So in Excel, when I'm passing in, say, I want to do my initial connection, and I'm using that ODC, that Office Data Connection file, to create my connection to my tabular database, I can specify whether or not I want to use DirectQuery or whether or not I want to use in-memory. It's difficult to connect to if users don't know to specify in-memory in the connection string if you're connecting through something like Excel. So if you go to Excel and I just try to connect to a tabular database by default that's in direct query mode. Let's create a new workbook here. Here's my on-time performance in my direct query, and I click on model, and I click on next, and then I click finish. It's going to say that MDX and SQL operations are not supported in direct query mode. But what I can do is I could come up and under my properties, I could change the definition in my connection string here, and I could change it to say I only want to see, or I want the connection string to be in memory. However, if I don't have really savvy business users, that's going to be a really big pain for me to try to teach them how to do that. So there we go. So my last one here, as I got, is in memory with direct query, which is it's still a hybrid mode, so just like the last type, I have direct query in memory, but instead of using direct query as the default, I'm going to use in memory as my default. So I'm going to process and store things in X velocity, so it's going to be in memory, and I can select what option I want by setting the property in the connection string. It's going to use X velocity by default if I don't specify it, and the really nice thing about that is as I go through to connect on it, if I don't have savvy business users, it's just going to connect them to it in memory. They're going to be using it. But let's say I have a really savvy business user that wants that real-time live data, we can use in-memory with direct query, and they can specify if they want to see direct query as their connection string. But they'd have to use something other than Excel to browse off of it. And that is it. Yay, PowerPoint's over. And to change it, I need to make sure that I change it in both places. So I want to change this query mode here to DirectQuery. And not only do I want to make sure that I change it here to DirectQuery, I also want to make sure that before I do that, I right-click on this project, on this property for this BIM file, and I want to make sure that I change this DirectQuery mode from off to on, which is going to trigger it to run all those rules to make sure that everything I've got will adhere to a DirectQuery rule set. And the reason why I use the different database here is just because I have so much going on in the AdventureWorks that it would have taken me a really, really long time to clean it up to get it to go to Tabular, so I wanted to use something a little bit simpler. So that's a lot of the really nice features that I can do in Tabular. There was one more that I wanted to show you guys, which is honestly one of my single most favorite things about a tabular database, in the fact that I can dynamically set what my bands are. So if you've worked with dimensions that, or dimensional attributes that are kind of between a range, you'd be familiar with banding. And let's say I have stuff that's between 0 and 500. I'm going to say it's a low dollar amount. Stuff between 500 and 2,000, it's going to be a medium dollar amount, and then anything above that is my high selling products. I could set that in a property and analysis services multidimensional. Typically, the more common scenario was I built it into my data warehouse directly, so I had a dimension table that had all my information on it, and in my dimension table I'd have the actual attribute, so say unit price for product or something, and then right next to that I'd have a price band column, and that would tell me what corresponding price band that unit went into. It was a highly volatile, so changing all the time, going like crazy, just constantly updating. Every time the business came along and said, well, we've decided that $500 is just kind of a bit much for our sales, or for our low price band, so we want to lower that. We want to lower that down to 300. So you'd say, okay, I got to go in, I got to modify the ETL, I got to change the table, I've got to reprocess the cube. It's going to take me all this time to do it. What's really nice about Tabular is you can actually give control of that directly to the business. So I have a unit price band table here that I've just created. It took me 5 seconds to create my price band table. I've got my low prices, my medium prices, and my high prices, and then I got my premium prices. Very simple table. Right? I'm just Sally Joe business user, and that's just what I created. In my Tabular database, I actually imported that. And to import it, I created a new connection, and down at the bottom, I created to an Excel file. And then I connected to where that Excel file was. And I'm going to go back into my existing connections here, so I can click on open on this. Oh, got to make sure Sally's not using it. It's rule number 1. And then once I've done that, it's going to detect all the worksheets that I have. So I'm going to call this source my banding matrix. And then maybe I have one Excel spreadsheet that my data steward uses, and that's what I use to manage all the banding matrices within the company. So I have one for unit prices, and I have one for costs, and I have one for employee salaries. All that stuff I can manage from one place and just have one person take care of it, and I can just import in that table. So once I click Finish, it's going to import my table. And then once it imports my table, your first reaction is going to be you want to join into something. But the problem is I don't really have anything that I can join that on. DAX doesn't support range lookups the way that SSIS does with a lookup component, or that I could do in T-SQL. So I've just got my banding matrix table down here, and it's just sitting here. It doesn't join to anything. It's literally just existing within the model. But I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to hide the whole table from all client tools. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I want to make sure that they don't use the wrong banding matrix when they're trying to browse that data. I only want to see, here's here's what relates to my facts for this internet sale. So I've got my table. I have no relationships at all. I can go back to my grid view, and then in my internet sales, or in my fact table, I'm going to create a new price band column. And in my price band column, I'm going to use a calculate function, and I'm going to calculate what that range is. So I'm going to pass in the unit price band, and I'm going to say find it if it's between 0 and 800 and assign it to low, or find it if it's between 500 or 1,000 and whatever, 5,000, make it high. But I can do that all dynamically. So I'm going to say, calculate, and I want to make sure that this if error clause is in here, so that way if I run across a value that's not covered from my business, so let's say somebody started, let's say low was between 0 to 800, and then due to an oversight, they put as medium prices, say 900 to 2,000. Well, anything that would fall between that 800 and 900 would render an error because there is no matching value in that band. So I want to make sure that I put this if error clause in there to handle that if I get anything that's out of a scope or out of a range. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to say there's no band found if I'm going to find an error. Otherwise, I'm going to take the high value in the banding matrix, which is the third column over there on the right, and I'm going to say where it's less than or equal to the earliest value of my internet sales unit price. Or I'm sorry, greater than or equal. And then I'm going to say the low value needs to be greater than, or needs to be less than the earliest internet sale unit price. So that way I can do that calculation between those two. And this is how I'm getting around doing that range lookup. So I'm doing the range lookup, I'm just not doing it on the diagram view, I'm doing it with my calculation. And when I do that, I'm going to get a whole new column here, which is all of my price bands populated from the beginning all the way to the end. And if I come into Excel, and I'm going to create a, let's connect to it. And I'm going to connect to my tabular model. Let's connect to Internet Products. And as I do that, I'm going to drag over, say, Internet Total Units. And then I have a column here in my Internet Sales Fact Table, which is my table that I'm using as both a fact and a dimension, which I can do in Tabular, and that's okay. I'm going to drag my price band on here, and now I have all my Internet Total Units that were between low prices, medium prices, and high prices. And if the business comes to me and says, I want to change that, you can say, okay, pull up your unit price band table that you have in Excel, and just change the value. And as soon as they change the value and change it, so let's say this is 1001, when I go to reprocess this tabular database, it's going to automatically detect that change and automatically update everything in that price band for me. So without me having to do anything besides the initial setup, I've given the business the ability to change what they want to see on any given level. That's one of, I think, my favorite things about Tabular is it's so much easier to give control of stuff like that back to the business rather than spending an extra 2-3 days developing it only to have it change every month. And that's it. I know we have some questions. I'm sure we do, so I'm going to pop over here. And I actually haven't seen anything, but do you have any questions there for me, Rachel?
Yeah, we do have a couple. Let's see what we got. Is the purpose of a perspective to create submodels within your security context?
No, it's only used to create a better browsing experience. So if I'm Joe business user and I come in here every day and I know that every day when I want to search for it, I want to see this specific fact table and I want to see this specific dimension. Rather than me giving Joe a list of 20 tables that he's got to filter through to find the 2 that he cares about, I can just give him the perspective and he can connect to it. But you cannot use it for security. If you wanted to use it for security, you'd have to go with a dynamic security model approach like we had.
Okay, and where does DAX evaluate query fit into perspectives? How can you save named queries?
Well, there are no named queries in DAX. So unlike in multidimensional, you could kind of probably force it with a perspective, or with a partition rather. You could come up to partition and change it in your SQL query to only pull what you wanted to see with your named query. Or I'm trying to think where else you could do it. You could probably do it from a table. Yeah, if you came up to table properties, you could specify what you wanted to pull in, so you could switch to query editor and then just pull in what you wanted to see. And that, I guess that would be your named query. But typically, you should try to use a view in your source rather than your named query to start. So that way you're protected from some abstraction there in case the model underneath changes.
Okay. And instead of specifying a specific username, can you specify an ad group?
Yeah, you could.
And what
so
about...
you could assign people in that user security table to that AD group, and then that AD group would just have all of your people that belong to it. So it would be a much cleaner model than trying to do each individual user.
Okay. And Anthony says, what about persistent calculated columns?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you wanted, if you were creating it and you never wanted it to change, you could hard-code it in as a view in the source or create it as a column in your source, but you couldn't kind of stick it there and just make it stay that way forever. Or if you wanted to say, I guess the other way I could think about persistent is if it was just like a value all the way down.
He said it was when you said no calculated columns.
Oh, yeah, with DirectQuery mode, yeah, you can't do anything like that at all. So if it's not in the relational source, you can't touch it.
Okay.
You could create measures and you can create KPIs, but you cannot adjust the actual structure of the table at all.
And in Power View, some of the measures do not show as measure. How can this be formatted in Tabular?
It probably depends on what context you're putting it in. So if I have gross profit here, for example, up on the screen, and in my gross profit, it's a calculation of my gross profit for every single unit that I've got all the way down. This would not cause it to show up as a measure in Power View. However, if I came down here and I said equals the sum of the sales amount, and I created my measure right here, that would cause it to show up as a measure in Power View. So it depends on what context you're putting it in. Up in the top, this is my filter context. So this is any column that I have, it belongs to my filter context. So it's something I can use to filter and slice and dice by. Anything down below in the 3 or 4 lines I've got down here, underneath the solid gray line, that's my values context. And my value context is where I can create all my measures and my calculations and my KPIs, and that's what will cause it to show up as a measure in Power View.
Okay, and who can use the Tabular, business user or developer?
To create it, the developer probably should. To browse it, the business user should. Now, a really nice feature in Tabular is there's all this talk about Power Pivot right now and how great Power Pivot is and how awesome it is for self-service. And what's going to happen is your business is going to do it, and I know there's a big concern out there from a lot of DBAs of, it's just continuing the spread mark problem that we've been having with Excel for years. And you can actually import a Power Pivot workbook into a Tabular database. So if you have a business user that's creating your Power Pivot workbook, you could just import it into a Tabular database and problem solved. But
okay.
Browsing it is going to be business. The developer is going to build the Tabular database.
And Daniel wants to know, what was the advantage of Tabular over Cube?
You mean multidimensional? Tabular is much faster than multidimensional is. So multidimensional, when it's processing all that stuff, it's storing it on disk, but every time I go ask it a question, it's got to, if it doesn't have it cached, it's got to go find it in its index and it's a partition. Tabular databases store everything in memory as they're processing. So as it's processing, it's picking all that stuff up and putting it in memory. So when I ask a tabular database a question, it can answer it much, much faster than multidimensional cubes can, because it's got the answer right there off the top of its head, where the multidimensional cube has to go find the answer if it doesn't already have it pre-aggregated in a cache file.
Okay, and Daniel says, so I need to deploy it the same as cube in AS.
Yes, you would. However, you'd have to have a tabular instance installed. So with SQL Server 2012, there's two different instances of analysis services. We used to just have one. We just had multidimensional. But now we have a tabular instance. And if you want to deploy a tabular model, you have to have a tabular instance on your machine. A common thing I see is actually installing both. So you have a tabular instance and a multidimensional instance. That way you can kind of pick and choose.
Okay, and I have one more question, and why multiple partitions per year versus one old and one current?
You could do that too. It all depends on your model. I just did that one for examples and for demos, but you could definitely have just an old and a new if you don't have too much data in your old partition. But yeah, it's 6 one way, half dozen the other.
Okay, and one more popped in. Can you have tabular in the standard edition?
I believe tabular is a feature of the standard edition, yes. Or actually, no, wait. I think it only comes with Business Intelligence Edition. I take that back. So you'd have to have Business Intelligence or Enterprise Edition to have tabular.
Okay, and Ronald says, can you merge partitions?
Yes, you can. So if you wanted to merge the partition, you could come in here to your SQL and you could change it. Or in Management Studio, just like you could in multidimensional, if I right-click on, say, Internet Sales and select Partitions, I can do everything that I could do in multidimensional. So I can delete partitions from here. I can merge them. So let's say I wanted to merge these two partitions. I'm going to get the Merge button, and I can click on it. And then it's going to ask me, what do I want to merge together? What do I want to call it? And then I'm going to click OK, and it'll merge all my partitions together.
Okay, and is Visual Studio 2012 now solid enough to be used for tabular model development? Example, not buggy.
It's not as buggy. I know they've put out a couple of service packs and a couple of cumulative updates to fix some of those initial issues that they had with it. I would say that, yeah, it's stable enough that you could do some heavy hardcore development against it to actually get it moving and ready to roll.
Okay, and how do I identify tabular instances?
If you connect to it in Management Studio, we'll see that my tabular little icon up here looks a little bit different than it does in multidimensional, which is, I know that's a really descriptive way to describe it, but if we'll connect to our multidimensional instance here, if we can get it to go. Come on. My machine's just boycotting me today. Come on. There we go. Another way that I could do is if I right-click on it and go into Properties, and I right-click on the properties of the instance, under the top up here, under Server Mode, it's the third one down on just the general information, it'll tell me whether it's tabular, or if I right-click on a multidimensional instance, it'll tell me that this one's in multidimensional. You can also check the config file, but it's much easier to just right-click on the server and go to the properties there.
And let's see, is multidimensional going away?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, when 2012 first came out and I heard about Tabular, I'll admit I was not happy because I actually have a really soft spot for multidimensional. I love multidimensional. I love what you can do with it. I love what it brings to the table. But the more I've dived into Tabular, I've realized that there are more tools to complement each other rather than one trying to kind of beat the other one out of the sandbox, so to speak. So whereas tabular databases are really good for some things, multidimensional databases are really good for other things. And tabular databases are never going to be able to replace everything that multidimensional can do when you talk about huge data sets. So you take Yahoo, for example. They have a 24 terabyte analysis services queue. You cannot, no matter how much memory in the world you have, you cannot put 24 terabytes in a tabular model. It's just never going to work. But as you get to those larger data sets and you get to the more enterprise level items, then yeah, you want to use multidimensional. Another way that I've heard it kind of described is tabular is more geared towards team style analysis services databases, and multidimensional is more enterprise. So if I have something like, let's say, call center statistics, that's going to be something that's pretty specific to just the call center team, right? I mean, that's the only thing that they want to know. So I can use a tabular database and give that to the call center team for a browsing experience. But then let's say I have something like finance data that everybody in the company wants to touch and everybody wants to see how we're doing to our gross profit. That's going to be something that's more multidimensional in nature because I can mine it, I can look for trends, I can do all this cool stuff with it in multidimensional that I can't necessarily do in tabular. But I don't think that tabular is going to kill multidimensional, and I don't think multidimensional is going to kill tabular. I think they really are two tools that complement each other really well.